we're moving on to the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, and that would include autonomic and somatic motor control. So this chapter focuses mostly on the autonomic nervous system, but we'll get the somatic motor neurons. Of course, we get that too, but that will be a separate lecture on the on muscle, on skeletal muscle. So the efferent division, of course, that would be information flow from the central nervous system toward the periphery. So therefore efferent with the E. And we do have here the somatic motor neurons that control skeletal muscle, but this lecture again will be mostly about the autonomic nervous system. And there are three effectors, and I'm going to repeat this about 10 more times at least. The effectors of the autonomic nervous system are, and please make sure that you know this, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. Okay, what are the effectors of the autonomic nervous system? Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. So effectors meaning that the autonomic nervous system, that's what it controls. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. In the autonomic nervous system, like the name says, everything is autonomic. It's sort of a standalone system that doesn't usually notify you when it's doing something. The autonomic nervous system is subdivided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic side. Now, the sympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system is known as fight and flight system or fight and flight response. And the parasympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system would be the rest and digest division. They work together with other endocrines or hormone functions and behavioral states to maintain homeostasis. So this slide here shows you the sort of dynamic balance between the autonomic branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system. Moving on. So the control centers here for the autonomic division, at the center of the autonomic nervous system is the hypothalamus. And you will see that, again, the hypothalamus is very important for endocrine function. So there's sort of your whole homeostatic control system centers around the hypothalamus. And of course, you have other branch or other effectors here involved. So for this lecture, again, we're mostly focusing on the autonomic responses, and then we'll get the endocrine things later. But either one is also connected to behavioral responses and to emotional responses like the limbic system. Anyway, so here the autonomic control centers, everything pretty much centers around that hypothalamus region, which is right here, just above the pituitary gland, and pituitary will be very important for the endocrine function. In the autonomic nervous system, you see typically antagonistic control. That means when the sympathetic side increases something, then the parasympathetic side would decrease it, or vice versa. So in other words, when one branch is excitatory and the other branch is inhibitory, good example is always the heart. If you're in a fight and flight kind of situation, you want to run, you're scared of something, and your heart rate increases. So that would be your fight and flight sympathetic response causing an increase in the heart rate. And when you are taking a nap after a big meal, you're in the rest and digest, parasympathetic side is prevailing, then you would have a nice and slow resting heart rate. So here's the typical kind of antagonistic control of one side of the autonomic nervous system increasing while the other side will decrease the same effector organ, in this case the heart. But you can see that throughout the autonomic nervous system, almost always it's antagonistic control. However, there are exceptions to that. So here are some examples given, showing here the sympathetic response on this side, and then the parasympathetic side on the response on the other side. So here, typical example, also the pupils of your eye. When you're in a fight and flight kind of response, your pupils will dilate, and the parasympathetic side, they will constrict. Or on the heart, we just talked about it, increase in heart rate, sympathetic, decrease in the heart rate, parasympathetic side. You can take a look at some of these. Most of them are antagonistic, but here let's take a look at an exception. The salivary glands, either way, there will be some saliva produced from salivary glands. On the sympathetic side, think about it. When you are in a fight and flight kind of response, your mouth is rather dry, and there's a very thick kind of mucousy secretion. When you were looking at a nice meal and it's this mouth watering, I want to eat this, smells good, looks good, then you have from the parasympathetic side a very more watery kind of secretion from the salivary glands. But either way, there will be secretions from the salivary glands. So you can take a look at those. Now, when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we are in the efferent division. That means we're starting in the central nervous system and we're ending up at the target tissue. Remember the target tissue, what is it? It could be either, the target tissue could be either, think about it, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or a gland. Okay, so I wrote it down. The target tissues here are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Now, how do we get from the central nervous system down to the target tissue, which could be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or gland? Well, we need two neurons, and we have the synapse at a ganglion here. And the first neuron, the one that leaves the central nervous system and goes to the ganglion, that's called the preganglionic neuron. And the second neuron that starts at the ganglion and then goes down to the target tissue, that one is known as the postganglionic neuron. Now they have the synapse at the ganglion, and the neurotransmitter that you see here is always going to be acetylcholine every single time. No matter whether you are on the sympathetic side or on the parasympathetic side, it does not matter. The neurotransmitter used at the ganglion to go from preganglionic to postganglionic neuron is always going to be acetylcholine. Now, the neurotransmitter down here, it just depends. If we're talking here about the sympathetic side, then the neurotransmitter here that we're using is called norepinephrine. If we're on the parasympathetic side, then the neurotransmitter that we're using here from the postganglionic neuron to the target tissue, that neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine. Now, here is the central picture that we'll spend most of the time for this lecture on. So this is sort of the summary slide for the entire autonomic nervous system lecture. Okay, it's a little crowded, but you can get through it. So let's sort this out. In the red, we have here the sympathetic side. In blue, over here, the parasympathetic side. Well, let's start on the left side. That will be the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Note that the preganglionic neurons, the ones that are exiting the spinal cord, they're all exiting here sort of in the thoracic region from here to here. So see that? Sort of in the middle part of your spinal cord. The sympathetic preganglionic neurons, they're leaving the spinal cord here. Then, of course, we said we need to synapse at a ganglion. Now, where are the ganglia on the sympathetic side? Well, they're really close to the spinal cord. In fact, they're just outside. So this is called the sympathetic chain ganglia, and they're just outside of the spinal cord here. And so we're going to be synapsing pretty quickly here. So we have a very short preganglionic neuron every time. And then we're going to synapse to the postganglionic neuron. Let's follow maybe, I don't know, the heart or the lungs, something like that. So let's go here from, on the sympathetic side, we're going to use a preganglionic neuron. And we're synapsing here at one of the sympathetic chain ganglia. And now we're going to go with the postganglionic neuron. We're going to go up here to the heart or to the lungs. You get the idea. On the sympathetic side, the postganglionic neuron is really long. And that you will see is going to be exactly opposite on the parasympathetic side. So on the parasympathetic side, we have a very, very long preganglionic neuron. We're almost going entirely down to the target tissue, which again would be either smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or gland. So on the parasympathetic side, we are exiting the central nervous system right here, either at the brain stem area or all the way down here in the sacral lumbar region right there. So no parasympathetic preganglionic neurons leaving sort of in the middle part of the spinal cord. Okay, so on the parasympathetic side, now as we're leaving, let's pick one of them. Let's pick something that goes to the maybe digestive tract or here to a gland, maybe pancreas. So we have a very long preganglionic neuron, super long. It almost goes all the way down to the target organ. You might think, oh, it's only one neuron. Nope, it's not. It's two neurons that are involved, just like on the sympathetic side, except that the ganglion is almost on the target tissue. So the preganglionic neuron on the parasympathetic side is really long. Then it still has to synapse at a ganglion, and then the postganglionic neuron is really, really short. Let's do another example. Let's do the heart. So we're starting here. That's going to be the vagus nerve on the parasympathetic side. The vagus nerve, vagus comes from vagabond. I don't know if you knew that, but vagabond means you have no home. You're a homeless person. You could go anywhere. So the vagus nerve just goes about everywhere, has no specific home. And in this case, we're going to go down to the heart right here, following the vagus nerve almost all the way down to the heart in this case. And then we still have to synapse at a ganglion, which is almost on the heart already. But we do have the synapse, and then we have a very short postganglionic neuron on the parasympathetic side. So one more time. On the sympathetic side, let's go back over here. On the sympathetic side, short preganglionic neuron. We're leaving the spinal cord sort of in the middle section of the spinal cord. We're synapsing at the sympathetic chain ganglia here. Many of them will do that. And then we have a very short preganglionic neuron, and then a long postganglionic neuron that goes down to the target tissue, which could be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland. Now keep in mind all the hollow organs, like your digestive tract, that's all smooth muscle. Your bladder, all of that, the uterus, all of this is smooth muscle. And then cardiac muscle, of course, is only the heart. And then we have a few glands here. You can see the pancreas, salivary glands, and some others. Okay, going over to the parasympathetic side, we have the preganglionic neuron will exit the spinal cord either at the level of the brain stem or down here in the sacral region. And then we have a long preganglionic neuron that goes almost all the way down to the target tissue, or here, going to the GI tract. The vagus nerve also goes down to the GI tract, this way, branching all over the place. But anyway, the preganglionic neuron is long on the parasympathetic side, going almost all the way down to the target tissue. We still have to synapse at the ganglion, and then we have a short postganglionic neuron. Okay, so let that sink in for a little bit. I know that was quite a bit, but this is sort of the main information right here, this slide. And I know it's crowded, but it pretty much gives you all the information that you need. Let's take a look at the vagus nerve, because that one is so important. It contains about 75% of all parasympathetic fibers. And if you go back to this slide, you can tell that it's almost going everywhere. I mean, this is just a majority of these parasympathetic fibers. Sensory information from internal organs to the brain are also carried on the vagus nerve, and then we have output from brain to organs. But for this lecture, the most important information here is that the vagus nerve is the majority of those parasympathetic fibers. And here, taking a look at sympathetic versus parasympathetic pathways and the neurotransmitters involved. So on the sympathetic side, again, we have that short preganglionic neuron. It's not really showing the length of these neurons, but anyway. So on the sympathetic side, short preganglionic neuron. At the ganglion, we synapse, we're using acetylcholine. As I told you before, oops, I almost scratched it out, but it's supposed to be acetylcholine. Either way, it's always acetylcholine. We have nicotinic type of acetylcholine receptors here. But anyway, the important information is we're using acetylcholine two synapses here from preganglionic to postganglionic neuron. Then, of course, on the sympathetic side, we have this long postganglionic